Hello, welcome to another World of UX podcast. This is your host, Dr. Darren Hood. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. Welcome, those of you that are listening for the first time. We are returning to our series today where we've been talking about UX maturity, the harsh realities of UX maturity, I should say. And we're going to dive in pretty quick. But before we get into the content tonight, I just want to give another shout out. Thanks to all of you who support the podcast. Thanks of you who take the time to like and subscribe. Please help us to work with these algorithms out here just to help get the word out and to help people in the UX discipline. That's what we've always done. That's what we set out to do on this show, is to help people grow, to help people to have an understanding of what's going on, to help people to be stronger in the discipline, to help people to ascend to higher heights and deeper depths, if you will. So thanks to all of you who support us out there. Now, today, the topic is going to be UX maturity and the quest for legitimacy. UX maturity and the quest for legitimacy. And I heard somebody talking about legitimacy recently, and it really struck me really hard. Wow, that is a really key term there. That's a really viable topic. And I began to think about UX maturity and how it's related. And so I just thought to share this presentation with you brief tonight. I'm going to move pretty quick in this particular episode. So legitimacy, getting right into it. What is legitimacy? Some people, when they think of legitimacy, they think of it as having a seat at the table. Some people, when they think about legitimacy, they think about it as being taken seriously. If you're taken seriously, then folks figure that you are indeed legit, that what you're doing has value, it has merit, it's something that people need to pay attention to, it's something that is serious, it's something that is of great importance. And so people want to be taken seriously. So that, again, legitimacy, that's what people think about. The third thing that comes to mind when I think about legitimacy is that some people think of it as having value ascribed to you and what you do. I mean, think about definitions. There's a lot of times 3, 4, 5, 6 definitions. So we're sort of approaching it from that perspective. And in so doing, we're covering what a lot of people think about when you think about legitimacy. I want to be legit. I want UX to be legit. And so this is something that's really, really key. The one that stands out to me is having a seat at the table. That's the one that you hear the most. They don't use the term legitimacy, but they do talk about having a seat at the table. They want to be accepted. That's another aspect of legitimacy. People want to be accepted by peers. They want to be accepted by other disciplines. They want to be accepted at work. When you come and talk about what UX is doing, you want people to take you seriously. You want to have that seat at the table. And interestingly, some people, they want the seat at the table, but they don't understand what it takes to get the seat at the table. So they want it. Everybody wants legitimacy. And a lot of people are frustrated. When you talk to a lot of people at your job, people around the discipline as a whole, a lot of people are very frustrated because we seem to run into a lot of brick walls. It's pretty common. You hear people all over the place talking about how difficult of a time they have trying to actually do the work. And this is a reality. It's a reality. And it's always been that way to an extent. And I want to make sure that people understand that. A lot of people, you hear them saying, oh, I think I want to get into UX. What can I do to, quote unquote, break into UX? And I won't talk about that today. I usually have some things that I talk about with that, and I won't get into that, not this time. But people want to come into UX, but they're not really counting the cost. They don't know what we're doing. They don't know about the hardships. They hear about the salaries. Some people think that it's an easy job. Some people see a person do UX work and they get excited about it because they saw that nice part of it. They didn't see the whole thing. And that factors into legitimacy to an extent. And people need to think about that. So there's a lot of brick walls out there. I've run into them a lot over the course of my career. There's different types of brick walls, and they're all real. Now, why is this though? Why is it so common for UXers to be considered an optional aside? That's one of the reasons that we encounter a lot of these brick walls. Let me explain it and frame this tonight by way of a brief history lesson. And I frequently give capsulized history lessons about UX. Let me give you another one. I'm going to give you a history lesson, then I'm going to double back, and I want to talk about various aspects as they pertain to UX maturity or as they're impacted by UX maturity. But let's go through the history lesson first. So, being roughly a 30-year-old discipline, folks, UX as we know it, it's roughly 30 years old. It is not much earlier than 1995, 1996 that UX started to become a thing. We didn't call it UX back then. I'll touch on that in a few moments. But for the purpose of this discussion, I'm just going to call it UX because that's what we call it now. So the discipline as we know it, it exploded. I know people say, what about Don Norman? He was UX at Apple. He was, but he had UX in his title, but folks didn't call UX for another 15 years almost. It was not called UX wholesale. So please know and understand that. But the discipline as we know it, it didn't really explode. It didn't really take center stage until the advent of the internet. And there were a lot of other monikers, a lot of other things that UX was known by. And I'll talk about that shortly. But that's the beginning of the history as we know it today. When the internet came on the scene, there were some people that started to do what we know as UX work now. Most of the work that was done in certain places. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but just know that it was the advent of the internet. My main point that I want to start off with is where we first got our foot in the door. So then number two, the first big pivot associated with UX, the first big stake in the sand, if you will, came to be when we were those first monikers, information architecture, interaction design. They tried to refer to us as experience designers. That one did not catch on. That's why I laugh sometimes when I hear some people today saying we should be called experience designers. And I know some people that have said that, and they're saying that we should pivot to that. And I respect and understand the people who've done that. But these people who think that they've discovered something, no, they haven't discovered something. And a lot of people in UX today do not know anything about our history and don't even care to know. It's important for us to know our history. Please know and embrace the history of the discipline. So the first big pivot from a moniker perspective, what we were known by earlier on was mostly information architecture and interaction design. Number three, most of the roles, the UX related roles, were in creative agencies. They were not in corporate spaces. There were very few corporations that had people in-house that were doing UX work. Most of that work was in creative agencies, and the corporations, point four, often hired the creative agencies to take care of their internet-based production work. Anything they had to do with that technological oriented experience, that was something that pretty much folks relied on the creative agencies to do that, and the corporations were hiring people out to do that. My first full-time gig was in a corporation. It was in a bank. It was in fintech to an extent, but mostly it was about the experience that customers of the bank had was our focal point. But that was a rare situation. And when I wanted to learn more about the discipline, I set my sights on working at a creative agency, and I learned a lot by working at creative agencies. People who've never worked at a creative agency do not understand UX the way that people who worked at creative agencies. Some people, their lens toward UX is only from a corporate perspective, and that is directly tied to UX maturity and why a lot of people don't get it, because at the creative agencies, they did understand the UX maturity was usually higher at the creative agency. There were a few agencies that had terrible UX maturity, but most, it was pretty sound. It was pretty sound. Next, the word got out, point 5, that every dollar invested in UX, some of you have heard this before, it yielded up to a $250 return. Usually they said for every dollar you invest, it was 100, but there were some reports that showed that it was up to $250 that would be returned for every dollar that you invested in UX. That was huge. Corporations got wind of that. And those studies were done by IBM and NASA mostly. There were other organizations that discovered the 250, but IBM and NASA's findings were the same. And people took note of that. Those big names, IBM and NASA, yeah, people paid attention. But when that happened, on to the next point, corporations began to pivot after that work got out, and they began to bring UX work in-house. There started to be a ramping up. So it wasn't just the creative agencies, but the corporations. All these UX openings started to pop up everywhere. And I'll give you a little bit of the UX maturity point here. The corporations started to hire a lot of UX folks, but they were not paying attention to, and they were not learning about what UX was, and nobody knew what UX maturity was for the most part, so nobody was paying attention to it, and things started to go haywire at that point. This resulted in a qualified labor shortage. This was the beginning of what we call the UX gold rush. You had all these positions, but you didn't have anybody to really fill them. And a lot of really bad things started to happen at that point in time. Companies began placing unqualified people in charge of their UX operations. From there, masses of unqualified people started forging their way into the discipline. And you start to get what I commonly or constantly refer to as posers, retrofits, and upstarts. So you got people in charge hiring people who don't know what they're doing. And so UX maturity is taking a hit. Again, getting a little ahead of myself. Hiring, of course, started to go sideways. And then around 2011, 2012, during what I call the siege against UX, that's when it started, hordes of visual designers who were finding out about how much UXers were making, which was way more than what the visual designers were making. And they started to fall in love with it, with the checks anyway. Some of them made transitioned in. I know some people who did. They did a great job transitioning in, but a lot of people didn't. You had hordes of visual designers who started taking on UX roles. And that's when people started to redefine what UX was. That's when the bastardization of UX started. And that's when people started saying UX UI. People were not saying UX UI before that. You can see job titles in people's profiles on LinkedIn where they said that they had a UX UI role in 2005. They did not. They doubled back and changed it to say that. So it makes it look like the title was used back then. It was not. That was not common until 2011, 2012, 2013. I personally did not start hearing it until 2013 and ended up having it in my title. I didn't think anything of it at the time, and I learned differently. We're going to talk about that in another episode very soon, but that's when the bastardization started. That was really bad. And then the last point, the perception of the discipline started to go sideways back then to the point where it's been going sideways ever since. And now, today, everything is sideways, pretty much. And I say everything loosely. There's some people that still practice pure UX, but a lot of people do not appreciate it, don't want to see it, have no interest in it. They just want to occupy space. We are now in a sideways discipline where toxicity has been normalized, where you can do the right thing and actually suffer because you do the right thing. You have a lot of insecure people who are occupying space, who have no desire. They want to do everything they can to try to strip the legitimacy of the people who actually earned legitimacy, and then occupy legitimacy and redefine legitimacy as something that doesn't even remotely come close to what UX really is. So let's go back now. I promised we were going to go back. Those are 12 points. So in the beginning, when you go back to 1995, 1996, the beginning of what we now refer to as UX, when the advent of the internet came along, UX maturity, of course, it was low because a lot of people, including the practitioners, didn't know a whole lot. And a lot of people were learning as they went. So we have to assume that UX maturity is low, but it's sort of accelerating. People are learning what to do fast. I learned a lot in the early stages, but for me, it was not until I started working at the creative agency that my learning took off. When I got around other people with higher UX maturity, because the UX maturity was not very, very high when I was working at that bank by the people that were there. We were having a ball. We were doing a great job. We were gaining and achieving a lot of wins. But when I look back at it, our UX maturity was not very high, not individually, not as a group. And we were certainly not reflecting a high discipline-wide UX maturity in the work that we were doing. It worked for what we were doing, but there were higher heights and deeper depths for us to achieve. And I knew that. And that was one of the reasons that I left, so I could achieve that. When we had our first big pivot with information architecture and interaction design, it was interesting because we were called information architects mostly, or we were called interaction designers. But back then, we did all the things. There were no specializations, or very, very few, I should say. We were called one thing, but we did a lot of other things. I was called an information architect in my first full-time UX gig, but I did research, I did usability, I did heuristic work. I worked on the information architecture, which was my title, but I worked on interface design. I worked on interaction design. I did strategy work, but my title was information architecture. And when the titles are skewed, that is actually reflective of lower UX maturity. It is important that we define ourselves properly and that we label ourselves properly. And when we don't label ourselves properly, then that is reflection of low UX maturity, and it is going to have detrimental impact upon the UX maturity because it's going to generate miscommunication. So that is huge. Most of the roles were in creative agencies. Again, I mentioned this earlier, higher levels of UX maturity at the creative agencies, higher personal UX maturity, higher organizational UX maturity, proper impact upon discipline-wide UX maturity, the educational UX maturity, the way people were learning were high. I grew by leaps and bounds when I worked at my first creative agency, and I worked at 3 over the course of my career, well, 4 technically. And everything that I learned at the first 3 was great. By the time I got to the 4th, almost everybody who worked there was a former visual designer, and the UX maturity at that organization was in the toilet. It was terrible. And at first, I was valued, but then the more I encountered those people who were the visual designers who just came to get the UX jobs and really didn't care about the discipline, folks, it is a constant that those people want nothing to do with people like me. Not just me, people like me. And it turned into an extremely toxic environment. The work environment was 1 billion% hostile because of that. Because of that thing, because these people, they didn't say, hey, this guy really knows his stuff. We can learn from him. He can really vault our practice forward. When somebody's UX maturity is low, that's not what they're saying. They want you gone. They want you to shut up. They will do everything that they can to make sure that you are dismissed from consideration and from operation because they want what they're presenting as UX, even though it is total garbage and it is not reflective of the discipline, not accurately reflective, but they're presenting that illegitimate presentation of UX to other people, stakeholders usually, and leaders who have low personal UX maturity, so they can get away with that. They can get away with trashing the real UX professional because the people who have to sign off on the decisions don't have the UX maturity that's high enough to understand what's really being done and the misrepresentation. So really key stuff. And this is another reason why, for people that are trying to shoot down UX maturity and trying to say that it's not important and we don't need it, the things that I'm talking about, that's what they're discarding. And that is very irresponsible, and it's not helping anybody, not truly. Not truly. When the word got out about every dollar being invested in UX, yielding up to a $250 return, and all the corporations who went from hiring the creative agencies because they had low UX maturity. They need somebody that has higher UX maturity to come and do it. They had enough sense back then to know that. But when the pivot came about the way that the investment, the return on the investment, I should say, happened, and they started bringing the work in-house, the UX maturity, nobody was thinking about it. And they started bringing the work in-house. So you went from having people with higher UX maturity doing the work from people with no UX maturity doing the work, because they were not often hiring those high maturity UX people to come in and do the work, to sit in there. You can look at people, you can look at the histories. There were instances where people did come in. People were hired to do the work, and it would help to keep that UX maturity streamlined. But a lot of times that is not what happened. And when that qualified labor shortage kicked in, UX maturity was the thing that was being sacrificed. The work was being done, or a semblance of the work was being done, but it wasn't being done the right way. And that is a huge problem anytime that something like that takes place. When the unqualified people started running the UX teams, bad UX maturity, guaranteed. When those people started hiring unqualified people to be on their teams, detrimental impact on UX maturity, not only for the individuals, not only for the org, not only for the team, but it had detrimental impact upon the discipline at large because it started to normalize it. And it's still normalized to this day because that is still a common practice, and it is terrible. The masses of unqualified people started forging their way into the discipline, and they got away with it because people with no UX maturity were screening these candidates and putting their stamp of approval on them. Hiring started to go sideways. The siege is being facilitated. It's being empowered. Just terrible. The bastardization of UX and people calling UX, UX UI, all that, as we see today. You see it. You're hard pressed to not see people who are saying that today, who have absolutely no idea the impact that that has upon the discipline at large. They have absolutely no idea, won't even consider it. They're so busy. A lot of times, these people are so busy defending their egos and putting their egos before the well-being of the discipline that they just don't care. And then people like me who take a stand against UX UI, they're upset with us. They engage in character assassination against us. They're where they are because of what people who were before us did, and they didn't say UX UI. The perception of the discipline started going sideways because there was a UX maturity problem. It's been going sideways ever since because we have an ongoing UX maturity problem. I delivered a talk in Austria 2 years ago where I was talking about how we need to work at triaging the discipline and trying to restore it to its former integrity, and people were upset. Even though they're all sitting around, we need a seat at the table. You're not going to get a seat at the table and then fulfill the call to the seat at the table, actually execute with integrity when you do get a seat at the table, if you ignore the kind of stuff that me and other people like me are talking about. So this is really, really critical, folks. Folks desire the legitimacy. They want the seat at the table, but they don't understand the historical ramifications of what I just talked about. They desire the legitimacy. They want the seat at the table, but they want that seat at the table to just happen. They want to just receive it. They want to be honored. They want to be respected. They want to be valued. This sense of entitlement. No, that's not how any of this works. And many don't realize that due to the abstract nature of UX, and it is, because of the relative newness, maturity has to be managed. Value perception must be earned. Folks, it is not automatic. And UX maturity is how we get there. If we embrace UX maturity and the associated challenge to manage and pursue UX maturity the right way, the legitimacy that everybody wants, it will be achieved. It's a byproduct. It's the get. Legitimacy is. It's the get from UX maturity. It's the thing that we achieve when we do it the right way. If we manage UX maturity, we will set the stage for holistic success. That is what we will accomplish when we do things the right way. Got to do it the right way, folks. We got to do it the right way. If we don't, legitimacy will elude you, even if you claim to have it. I've seen people who claim, yeah, our UX maturity is way up here. And I was evaluating it. I was on that particular team some years ago. And they said, no, it doesn't work like that. Matter of fact, there was a UX maturity model that was published by someone, and every level basically gave people and teams a pat on the back. There's no way in the world that UX maturity that was chock full of toxic positivity was going to actually yield the proper mindset and the proper critical thinking that was going to help people understand where they are and help them understand what they could set their sights on. And UX maturity should set that type of a stage. It should help people to understand where they are and let them know what they can do if they want to achieve a higher level. I call it the UX maturity participation trophy. That's what that particular thing was. I'm not going to say who it was. And that was a very famous person that created it as well. Not a good thing. Not a good thing. So that person, in publishing that type of UX maturity, had detrimental impact on UX maturity. And it was a manifestation that they had a low level of personal UX maturity, because you wouldn't try to make everybody feel good. It's like those kids that go out and they play soccer and the team loses 20-0, but they're all going to go and get pizza and ice cream anyway. That's not how you help people advance. That's not how you help people grow. If you've done something and you need to improve, you need to come into knowledge of where you need to improve. And proper views of UX maturity help us to achieve exactly that. Again, if you manage UX maturity, you set the stage for holistic success with everything that you're doing and in every type of UX maturity that you touch. But if you don't, again, it's going to elude you, even if you claim to have it. Folks, when it comes to UX maturity and the quest for legitimacy, choice is yours. I encourage you to pursue it today the right way. That's it for today, folks. We're going to sign off here. We hope you got a lot out of this. I hope they help sharpen your saw when it comes to UX maturity and the quest for legitimacy. Tune in next week as we cover another topic about UX maturity. We keep going with this particular series. Don't forget, like, share, let folks know about the show. Help folks to understand, folks, we're talking about pure UX. We're trying to help people grow. We're trying to drive the discipline forward. And we're thankful for those out there who do appreciate what we're doing. Shout out all of you. And until next week, this is Dr. Darren Hood signing off and wishing everybody all the best. Until next time, happy UXing, everybody.